You're listening to Guardians of Galen, your go-to podcast for USC Trojan basketball.
Let's get started.
Welcome back to Guardians of Galen, the podcast centered around USC basketball. I'm your host, Casey Kasliner, here on Wednesday night as the Trojans trot into Lincoln, Nebraska, and narrowly take down the Cornhuskers 78-73, a gritty, tough win for Eric Musselman's team. And a big morale boost heading into rivalry week against UCLA. The Trojans now with 3 wins in their last 4 bouts. And a tough win for sure. Nebraska down the stretch made their last 4 field goals. Really looked like they could get this game closer as the Trojans started to pull away. But nonetheless, the Trojans squeak out another victory, another hard-fought one down the stretch in what was another amazing game from Desmond Claude. 21 points for him, the Xavier transfer, of course. And he was kind of coming off a tough performance against Wisconsin, only getting up 7 shots in that game, playing 31 minutes as opposed to around 40, only with 9 points. But tonight, 8 of 18 from the floor, playing a full 40 minutes, and he certainly had to, scoring 21 points and really leading the Trojans' transitional attack that really catalyzed their win tonight. I want to talk about that transitional attack. The Trojans had 16 points off turnovers, whereas Nebraska only had 6, and I think that's really the difference tonight. The Trojans kept the turnovers pretty low, only 9 the entire game. Nebraska had 11, but the amount of points the Trojans had off the turnovers, 16 off 11 total turnovers, really speaks to their efficiency and ability to lead that transition, something that Eric Musselman has really emphasized this season, and it's looking great. Now, in this game, there's a couple facets of it that I think are really interesting. First of all, the Trojans were outshot from beyond the arc in many of their games this season, but in this one, the Trojans shoot 6 of 21 from beyond the arc, which of course isn't efficient or great by any means, but Nebraska only shoots 5 of 24, and Nebraska has been struggling lately, and this was a great game from Juwan Gary, sort of a unsung hero in this game. He didn't have it going from beyond the arc 0 of 5, but he scores 27 points, a career high for him, and I mean, he came into this game only scoring about 12 per game. And, you know, of course, we all know that Bryce Williams has been such a great player for Nebraska. He's a top 5 scorer in the Big Ten this year. And USC, of course, held him below his season average, which I think is a win in my books. Another key stat that I thought was interesting is the Trojans were not out-rebounded in this game. Now, the Trojans in the Big Ten are second to last in rebounds per game, but in this one, they out-rebound Nebraska by 5. And you really have to thank Chibuzo Abo for that one. He grabbed 9. But on the topic of Abo, I think it's really interesting looking at his shooting slump lately from beyond the arc. He just seems to not really have the same stroke he did earlier in the year. In the past 2 games for USC, of course, including the tough 15-point loss against Wisconsin, Abo is 1 of 9 from distance in his last 2 games. And that's just really hard to see at this point from a guy whose specialty, at least offensively, is shooting from beyond the arc. He was also 0 of 6 from the field tonight. And it just seems like he's really not playing that guard role that, you know, he's meant to play in. And that's hard for, you know, a team like USC that doesn't have a true sharpshooting guard. Now, Wesley Yates, on the topic of guards, also has a great game. Maybe not the most exciting game for him from the floor. He's 4 of 10, but he makes all 9 of his free throw attempts. He gets to the line. And we talk about those points off turnovers. Wesley Yates III was really leading those charges, those attacks, and went up, getting and ones, and it was really exciting to see. Got himself in a little bit of foul trouble, but didn't bite at the end. But really was a big factor in USC's win tonight and is just continuing his dominance in his first collegiate season. Rashawn Agee with another great game under his belt, 5 of 8 from the field, but importantly, 4 of 6 from three-point range. 14 points for him. It seems like USC is discovering something they didn't know really Rashawn Agee had. It's the three-point stroke, and he really had it all tonight. And I think we all know that Rashawn Agee is such a versatile player. He's coming off a season at Bowling Green, his last year there, where he averaged nearly a double-double per game. He comes to USC. He doesn't really have that starting role, but in 3 of his last 4 games, he scored at least 13 points, with, of course, 14 tonight on very efficient shooting of around 63%. So a big win for USC to sort of summarize things, now to 4-4 in the Big Ten and moving up the Big Ten ladder slowly but surely. Again, for USC, they really thrived off the starting lineup, doing what it needed to do. I want to talk about Josh Cohen once again because he's had sort of an interesting role in the previous 3 games. In the past 3 games combined, not including Nebraska, he only played 17 minutes. Now, against Nebraska, he plays 18. And so it seemed like maybe Eric Musselman wanted to roll out with, a different approach against a team like Nebraska that has that versatile scoring ability. And they've struggled in recent games as well. But as we saw tonight, Juwan Gary is a guy that, you don't typically expect to go off and score 27 points. And sure enough, he does. And, the Trojans had to pay for that. And he was a big part of their runs. The Trojans did lead for the bulk of this game. In fact, close to 24 minutes of this game, USC led. There were 10 lead changes. It was a gritty game. It was close. But Juwan Gary was the reason why Nebraska was in it. But they've lost now 5 in a row after coming off a big win streak. They had 6 wins in a row and now have lost 5 in a row. And so a really interesting turnaround for the Cornhuskers. But I want to talk again about Bryce Williams. He's been that bona fide first option, and they hold him under his season average, granted only by 1 point, but he scored 17 points on 5 of 12 shooting, 2 of 8 from beyond the arc. And it was a cold shooting night for the Cornhuskers. Obviously Connor Essegian off the bench was huge for them with 15 points, but it felt like having Rashawn Agee off the bench for USC sort of canceled that out. I mean, both teams had that sort of 6-man coming in and doing the work, and USC was just fortunate enough to have its starting lineup, the big three that we're sort of seeing emerge of St. Thomas, Desmond Claude, and Wesley Yates step up. And I didn't really expect this earlier in the year. I didn't expect Yates to have maybe the role he's had this year and the success he's had in his breakout year. And Abo, like we mentioned, he's been cold lately and hasn't really had that scoring touch. And it's maybe given Yates the ability on offense to sort of emerge into that guard role that he set out to be. And Abo, he's a great rebounder. He's led the team in rebounds the past 2 games. And maybe for him, he's sort of molding into a forward. I mean, he's 6'7", so it doesn't completely make sense for him to run the guard position every time. And as we're seeing, he's molding into maybe something different. Of course, like I said, he was 0 of 4 from beyond the arc. So a very interesting game for USC and a good one all around. I think for them, it was all about closing out the game strong. We've seen them this year, have some scares at the end of games or blow leads. And the Trojans actually were behind at halftime. They were down 33-31. And I think we've seen in plenty of games, it's been sort of the opposite. USC maybe leads at halftime. We saw in the Oregon game. We've seen in other games, and maybe they have a close battle in the second half, but just, can't close things out. But they outscore the Cornhuskers 47-40 and, hold a lot of their top scorers in that starting lineup to limited amount of points. Only a couple of guys in that starting lineup were actually able to score consistently, aforementioned Juwan Gary and Bryce Williams. And I think the Trojans have done a good job this year of limiting sort of those second, third option guys. It's just there's always seemingly one player that stands out. We saw it last game with John Blackwell. We saw it with Umar Ballo a few games ago. There's seemingly 1 or 2 players on the team that really have a great game, and the Trojans aren't able to contain them while maybe containing some of the depth pieces. But tonight, just, the ability to do what they needed to do. It wasn't a pretty game by any means, but they win regardless, and that's what matters. But Desmond Claude, I want to just talk about him one more time. He didn't rely on the free throws per se in this game. We saw against Iowa, he had 10 of 12 from the charity stripe, and that's what really helped him get to 25. But his efficient scoring inside has just been so invaluable for Eric Musselman's team. His ability to cut hard, his ability to take the ball up with strength down in the lane. And I think for him, he's the team's MVP by a long shot in terms of scoring and ability to space the floor and whatnot. But I think a lot of the things he does off the ball are really special. And of course, it is unfortunate that USC's first option point guard doesn't necessarily have the 3-point shot that, would be maybe expected. But he's doing so much inside to score. He's playing all 40 minutes. He's resilient. And I just think that Desmond Claude, his arrival to USC can't be cherished enough. And so, a big victory for USC, especially coming off a big loss against Wisconsin, a disappointing loss, had the chance to take the lead in certain moments and they blow it. But at the end of the day, this Trojan team has so much fight, and it seems like they're really generating that chemistry needed to compete in a conference like the Big Ten. And we've seen in other games, the Trojans haven't been able to necessarily respond. In a game against St. Mary's earlier in the year, non-conference game, but a big game for sure, they lost by nearly 40 points, and then they go on to lose their next 2. It seemed like they couldn't really find their footing. They couldn't get out of a slump, couldn't get out of a grave they've dug for themselves. But, we've seen here that they not only thrive off back-to-back wins at Illinois and versus Iowa, but they're responding against adversity, playing against Wisconsin where they really just didn't shoot well. They didn't do a lot of things well, and they struggled. But, they weren't perfect against Nebraska, and they just did what they needed to do to get that victory, and that's important. They shot 44% from the field, less efficient by 5% to Nebraska's 49%, but it was enough for them to squeak by. They made their free throws at 18 of 22, and I think this year, they struggled from the charity stripe at certain moments, and we know how big that is in college basketball. But USC as well, 21 bench points, big shots from Clark Slackert down the stretch. He was one of 3 Trojans to hit a three-pointer tonight, and a big one at best down the stretch. But this was a tough game for USC. 10 lead changes. This is a game that they're going to be thinking about a lot when they think about their high points in the season, especially, two, having a few days off to recoup, before you play UCLA and what's going to be one of your tougher games on the schedule. Looking ahead to UCLA, obviously it's a rivalry game, so the storylines come from that. The Trojans will play Kobe Johnson, who obviously was with USC for multiple years. Trent Perry was a recruit for USC who flipped. And this UCLA team, of course, USC and UCLA split last year, the season series 1-1, both teams winning on the road. But this team looks a bit different. Tyler Bilodeau is their leading scorer with about 14.5 points per game. Eric Daly has been good with double-digit scoring as well. But Kobe Johnson has really not stepped up to that veteran role we've really seen. He's scoring less than double figures. We know Sebastian Mack is continuing to get better, Dylan Andrews as well. So it'll be interesting to see. I've also just from watching UCLA, Lazar Stefanovic has not really been in as big of a role, and that's with, the team changing, of course, but he, of course, has been a three-point deadeye at points in his career. So it'll be interesting to see, how the Trojans are able to contain sort of those depth pieces as they've been able to do that pretty well this season, and we'll see what happens there. It should be an interesting one at home for USC, coming back to LA once again. And they've sort of been on and off at home. They're finally having the chance to come back and prove themselves against a tough opponent and a rival as well. And UCLA will have a game against Washington in between then. And so, of course, USC will have some time to scout and whatnot. But surely a big win for USC, and looking even more ahead, you're playing number 8 Michigan State, a top dog in the Big Ten. And that'll be at home, a big game for USC potentially, to make some noise, even if they don't win that game. Making it close. We've seen what they've been able to do against ranked teams like Illinois and Wisconsin, even Oregon. And so, of course, it's going to be a tough game for USC, no doubt about that. But against a team like Michigan State, we've seen how USC has been able to sort of rival with those big dogs. And I think USC is a team that you just can't really sleep on, especially considering their versatile scoring ability, their ability to go into games with sort of a clear-headed mindset, it seems, and kind of, forget what's behind them. And it seems like that's what's been their sort of anecdote the past 4 games. And so USC with a big win over Nebraska, 78-73, maybe not big in terms of margin of scoring, but a big win from a morale standpoint, heading into rivalry week with some steam. Desmond Claude leads the Trojans with 21, Jawan Gary with 27. What a game from him. And props to him for stepping up in a needed moment. They obviously don't win that game, but he really did it all except for scoring from beyond the arc. And if he makes, at least a couple of threes, we might have a different outcome. But that's pretty much going to do it from me. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Guardians of Galen. Make sure to follow all my USC basketball content on X. My handle is Casey Kasliner, all one word. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.